there's something almost invisible that happens in a moment most people would overlook. A hug. Simple, ordinary, something people give and receive every day without thinking twice. But when it comes to someone who lives behind emotional walls, someone who has trained themselves to stay distant, controlled, and unaffected, that same hug doesn't feel simple at all. It feels like something much deeper is being touched, something they've spent years trying to keep hidden, even from themselves. And what's strange is, they don't fully understand it in the moment. All they know is that something inside them shifts, softens, almost melts in a way that feels unfamiliar and hard to explain. Because what they truly crave isn't just the physical closeness, it's the feeling behind it, the safety, the quiet reassurance that for once they don't have to hold everything together. And that's where it begins. Not with dramatic words or big confessions, but with a subtle change you can't see unless you're paying attention. Because before that hug, they are composed, guarded, emotionally distant in a way that feels natural to them. They know how to keep conversations light, how to stay just out of reach, how to avoid anything that might pull them too deep. It's not something they consciously decide every time. It's just how they've learned to exist, to protect themselves, to stay in control. And for the most part, it works. They move through connections without fully letting themselves be affected. They keep their emotions contained, manageable, predictable, but then something interrupts that pattern. It doesn't come with warning. It doesn't ask for permission. It just happens in a moment where defenses aren't fully prepared. Maybe it's the way you move closer without pressure. Maybe it's the calm energy you bring, the absence of expectation. And when that hug happens, something inside them hesitates. Just for a second, a pause that didn't exist before. Because part of them wants to pull away, to keep that familiar distance. But another part, the part they don't usually listen to, doesn't move. And that hesitation matters more than it seems. Because in that small pause, they feel something they're not used to feeling. Not intensity, not pressure, but a quiet kind of safety. The kind that doesn't demand anything from them, the kind that doesn't try to change them or force them to open up. And for someone who is used to protecting their space so carefully, that feeling is disarming. It doesn't trigger their usual defenses. It doesn't make them want to escape immediately. Instead, it creates confusion. A soft, unfamiliar confusion that makes them stay just a little longer than they normally would. And that's when the shift begins. At first, they don't call it anything. They don't label it as comfort or connection. They just notice that something feels different. Their body relaxes in a way they didn't expect. Their thoughts, which are usually so quick to analyze and evaluate, slow down for a moment, and in that brief stillness, they feel something they haven't allowed themselves to feel in a long time, not because they didn't want it, but because they didn't trust it. Because for them, closeness has always come with conditions, expectations, the risk of being seen too clearly, of being needed too much, of losing control over their own emotions. So they learn to stay distant, to keep things manageable, to avoid anything that might pull them into that vulnerable space. But a hug like this, it doesn't feel like those past experiences. It doesn't come with pressure. It doesn't ask them to explain themselves or reveal anything they're not ready to share. It just exists. And that's what makes it powerful. Because in that moment, they realize something without fully understanding it. That closeness doesn't always have to feel overwhelming. That being near someone doesn't always mean losing themselves. And that realization is both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Comforting because it gives them a glimpse of something they've been missing. Unsettling because it challenges everything they've believed about staying safe. So they stay there, even if just for a second longer than usual. And that second matters more than you think. Because inside them, something softens. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to create a crack in the walls they've built, and through that crack, emotions they've kept hidden begin to surface. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something that has been waiting for the right moment to be felt again. And that's where the melting begins. It doesn't look the way people expect. There are no obvious signs, no dramatic reactions that make it clear something important just happened. On the outside, they might still seem composed, still in control. They might even pull away shortly after, creating distance again as if nothing changed. But what you don't see is what's happening underneath that surface, because that hug lingers, not physically, but emotionally. Long after the moment passes, they replay it in their mind, not intentionally at first. It just comes back to them in quiet moments when they're alone, when there's nothing to distract them. And each time it does, they feel that same unfamiliar softness again, that same sense of calm that didn't demand anything from them. And it confuses them because they're not used to associating closeness with peace. They're used to associating it with risk. So now they're caught between two opposing feelings. One part of them wants to dismiss it, to treat it as something small and insignificant, just a hug, nothing more. But another part of them, a quieter, deeper part, knows it meant something, even if they can't explain why. And that internal conflict is where things start to change. Because once they've felt that kind of safe closeness, even briefly, it becomes harder to ignore what they've been missing. It becomes harder to fully return to the emotional distance that once felt so natural. Not impossible, but different. Less satisfying, less convincing. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because you didn't force anything, you didn't break their walls down. You didn't demand access to parts of them they weren't ready to share. You simply created a moment where they felt safe enough to lower their guard on their own, even if just a little. And that small opening, it stays with them. But here's where it gets complicated. Because right after that softness, right after that moment of emotional melting, something else begins to surface. Fear. Not loud or obvious, but subtle and persistent. The kind of fear that doesn't come from what just happened, but from what it could mean. Because if a simple hug can make them feel this much, what happens if they let themselves feel more? That question alone is enough to make them pull back, not because they didn't like the moment, but because they did. Because it reached a part of them they don't usually let anyone near, and that kind of emotional exposure feels dangerous to someone who is used to staying protected. So they instinctively try to regain control, they create space again, they return to familiar patterns, they act as if everything is the same as before. But it's not. Because now there's awareness. Now they know what that kind of closeness feels like when it's safe, when it's calm, when it doesn't come with pressure or expectations. And even if they try to ignore it, that feeling doesn't disappear. It stays somewhere in the background, quietly influencing the way they see you, the way they respond to your presence. They might not express it, they might not even fully understand it, but it shows up in small ways, in the way they hesitate before pulling away, in the way they stay a little longer in conversations, in the way their defenses don't come up as quickly as they used to. And those small changes matter. Because for someone like them, change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments like these, subtle, almost invisible shifts that slowly reshape how they experience connection. And that hug becomes one of those moments. What they truly crave isn't something they can easily put into words. It's not just affection. It's not just closeness. It's the feeling of being able to exist next to someone without having to protect themselves at every second. It's the quiet reassurance that they won't be overwhelmed, that they won't be forced into something they're not ready for, that they won't lose themselves in the process of getting close to someone else. And that's exactly what that hug gave them. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to show them what's possible. And once they've felt that, even briefly, it changes something inside them. It creates a reference point, a memory of what safe connection feels like. And even if they don't chase it immediately, even if they continue to move slowly and cautiously, that memory stays with them. Because deep down, beneath all the avoidance, beneath all the distance and self-protection, there's a part of them that has always wanted that kind of connection. They just didn't believe it could exist without risk. Until that moment. Until they felt it for themselves, and that's why they melt. Not because they're suddenly open or transformed, but because for a brief second, they stop resisting what they've always needed. They allow themselves to feel it without overthinking, without pulling away immediately. And in that moment, they experience something real, something safe, something they can't easily forget, even if they try to act like it didn't matter. because it did, more than they will ever say out loud. And what makes this even more complicated is that they won't come forward and tell you any of this. They won't sit down and explain how that moment affected them, how something as simple as a hug stayed with them longer than they expected. In fact, they might do the opposite. They might act normal, detached, maybe even slightly distant, as if nothing meaningful happened at all. And if you're not aware of what's happening beneath the surface, it can feel confusing. It can feel like you imagine the connection, like the moment didn't land the way you thought it did, but the truth is, it landed deeper than you realize. They just don't know how to handle it yet. Because for someone who has spent so much time controlling their emotions, keeping everything contained and predictable, a moment like that disrupts their internal balance. It introduces a feeling they can't easily categorize or manage, and when they can't control something, their instinct isn't to move closer to it, it's to step back and create space. Not because they didn't feel anything, but because they felt too much. And that's the part most people misunderstand. They think distance means disinterest. They think pulling away means the connection wasn't real. But with someone like this, it's often the opposite. The more something touches them, the more carefully they handle it, the more distance they create, not to erase the feeling, but to understand it without being overwhelmed. And during that space, something quiet continues to grow. Because even while they're distant, even while they're trying to return to their usual patterns, that moment keeps replaying in subtle ways, not constantly, not obsessively, but enough to remind them that something shifted, enough to make them question the walls they've built. What they begin to notice, slowly and almost reluctantly, is that their usual way of keeping distance doesn't feel as comfortable as it used to. Before, it was easy, natural. They didn't have to think about it. Emotional space felt like safety, like control, like something they could rely on to protect themselves from getting too involved, too vulnerable, too exposed. But now there's a contrast, because they've felt what it's like to be close without pressure. And once that contrast exists, it changes everything. Suddenly, the distance they once preferred feels a little emptier, a little quieter, in a way that isn't entirely comforting. It's not painful, but it's noticeable, like something is missing that they didn't realize mattered before. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly in small moments, when they think about you without meaning to, when they remember how calm they felt in that brief closeness, when they catch themselves hesitating before fully retreating again. And that hesitation, that's where the change lives. Because even though their instincts still tell them to keep their distance, there's now another voice inside them, quieter, less familiar, but present. A voice that reminds them that closeness didn't hurt the way they expected it to, that maybe, just maybe, it's not something they always have to avoid. And that internal conflict creates something new, not clarity, but curiosity. And curiosity is something they're not used to feeling when it comes to connection. Usually their reactions are predictable. Stay safe, stay distant, don't go too deep. But now there's a part of them that wants to understand why that moment affected them the way it did, why it felt different, why it didn't trigger the same discomfort or urge to escape. And instead of immediately shutting that curiosity down, they sit with it, even if just for a little while. They start to notice things about you that they might have overlooked before. The way you don't rush them, the way you don't demand explanations, the way your presence feels steady instead of overwhelming. And slowly they begin to connect those things to the feeling they experienced in that hug. They begin to realize that it wasn't just the physical closeness that made them feel that way. It was you, or more specifically, the way you made that moment feel safe. And that realization is both grounding and unsettling at the same time. Because if the feeling is connected to you, then it means you matter in a way they can't easily dismiss. It means the connection isn't as surface level as they might have preferred. It means there's something real forming beneath the calm exterior they try to maintain. And that's where things become even more complicated. Because now it's not just about a moment anymore. It's about what that moment represents And what it represents is the possibility of something deeper, something they haven't fully allowed themselves to experience in a long time. But with that possibility comes fear. Not because something is wrong, but because something is real. And reality, when it comes to emotions, feels unpredictable to them. It feels like something that could grow beyond their control if they're not careful. So they move carefully. They don't rush forward. They don't suddenly become expressive or open. Instead, they test the space in subtle ways. They stay a little longer than usual. They respond a little more thoughtfully. They let small moments of connection happen without immediately shutting them down. And those small shifts might not seem like much on the outside, but for them, they're significant. Because every small step toward closeness feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory, territory where they don't have full control, where emotions aren't neatly contained, where they have to trust something outside of themselves. And trust is not something they give easily, but that hug, that moment, planted something. Not certainty, but the beginning of trust. And once that seed is there, it doesn't disappear. It might grow slowly, it might face resistance, but it exists now in a way it didn't before. And that changes how they see everything moving forward. So when you look at them and wonder what they truly crave, the answer isn't as complicated as it seems. They crave moments like that. Moments where they don't feel pressured to be anything other than what they are. Moments where they can experience closeness without the fear of losing themselves. Moments where connection feels calm instead of overwhelming, safe instead of demanding. And the reason they melt in those moments is because they're finally experiencing something they've been missing, even if they didn't fully realize it. Not intensity, not drama, but quiet, steady, safe connection. And that kind of connection reaches them in a way words never can. It bypasses their defenses. It softens their instincts. It shows them, without forcing them, that closeness doesn't always have to come at a cost. And even if they don't say it, even if they continue to move slowly, cautiously, sometimes pulling back just as much as they move forward, that moment stays with them because it wasn't just a hug, it was proof. Proof that what they've been protecting themselves from might also be what they've been needing all along. And once they feel that, even briefly, a part of them never fully goes back to the way it was before. And even though something inside them has shifted, even though a part of them has quietly softened in a way they can't fully undo, it doesn't mean the journey suddenly becomes easy. If anything, it becomes more complicated. Because now they're aware. Before, distance was automatic. It didn't require thought. It didn't create inner conflict. It was simply how they functioned, how they stayed safe without questioning it. But now, after feeling that kind of closeness, they can't move the same way without noticing the difference. They notice when they pull away too quickly. They notice when they shut something down that felt good just moments before. They notice the quiet tension between what they're used to doing and what they're starting to feel. And that awareness creates discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because something inside them is changing faster than they're ready to accept. So they begin to move in a way that feels inconsistent. One moment, they're present, softer, slightly more open than before, and then without warning, they retreat. Not completely, but enough to create distance again, enough to feel like they're back in control. And if you're watching this from the outside, it can feel confusing. It can feel like mixed signals, like they're unsure about you, like they're going back and forth without any clear direction. But what's really happening is that they're learning how to exist in a space they've never fully allowed themselves to stay in before, a space where they feel something real and don't immediately run from it. Because the truth is, they don't just crave connection. They crave connection that doesn't cost them their sense of self. And that's a very specific kind of closeness, one that feels calm instead of consuming, one that allows them to breathe instead of making them feel like they're being pulled into something they can't control. That hug, that moment, gave them a glimpse of that kind of connection. And now, without fully realizing it, they start comparing everything else to it. They notice when interactions feel too intense. They notice when something feels forced or rushed. They notice when their usual instinct to withdraw doesn't come from fear, but from something not feeling right. And this is where something subtle but important begins to happen. They start becoming more selective, not in a cold or calculated way, but in a quiet, internal way. A way that makes them pause before engaging, before opening up, before letting themselves get close. Because now they know what safe closeness feels like. And once they know that, they can't unknow it. So instead of completely avoiding connection like they once did, they begin to look for something that feels similar to that moment, something that carries the same calm, the same steadiness, the same lack of pressure. And when they find even a small piece of that again, they don't pull away as quickly. But even as they begin to lean into those moments, even as they slowly allow themselves to experience closeness in a way that feels less threatening, there's still a part of them that struggles to trust it because their past hasn't taught them that connection is safe. It's taught them that connection can become overwhelming, that it can lead to expectations they're not ready to meet, that it can slowly take away their independence if they're not careful. So even when something feels good, even when it feels right, they question it. They wonder how long it will stay that way. They wonder if there's something they're missing. They wonder if getting used to that feeling will eventually lead to disappointment. And those thoughts don't come from a place of negativity. They come from a place of self-protection. Because for them, it's not just about enjoying the moment, it's about making sure the moment won't turn into something they can't handle later. And that's why their process looks slow. That's why their reactions seem delayed. That's why they don't fully give in, even when a part of them wants to, because they're not just experiencing connection, they're learning how to trust it piece by piece. And if you look closely, you'll start to see that their way of showing care doesn't come through big gestures or obvious emotional expressions. It shows up in smaller, quieter ways. In the way they stay when they would normally leave. In the way they listen more closely, even if they don't say much in return. In the way they remember little details they don't point out. In the way their presence becomes more consistent, even if it's still reserved. And most importantly, in the way they don't completely close themselves off after feeling something real. Because that's the biggest shift of all. Not that they suddenly become open or expressive, but that they don't fully retreat back into who they were before. There's a part of them now that remains slightly open, slightly softer, slightly more willing to stay connected, even if it's in their own quiet, careful way. And that part of them exists because of moments like that hug, moments where they felt safe enough to lower their guard and realize the world didn't fall apart when they did. So when you think about what they truly crave, it comes down to something very simple, but very rare for them. They crave a connection where they don't feel the need to protect themselves all the time, a connection where they can exist without constantly preparing to pull away, a connection where closeness feels like something they can move toward instead of something they have to manage or escape from. And that's why something as small as a hug can affect them so deeply. Because in that moment, they're not thinking about the future. They're not analyzing what it means or what could go wrong. They're just feeling. And for someone who spends so much time staying in control, staying guarded, staying distant, that moment of simply feeling without resistance is powerful, it's rare, and it's something they don't forget. Even if they don't talk about it, even if they don't show it in obvious ways, even if they continue to move slowly, carefully, sometimes confusingly, that moment becomes part of how they understand connection moving forward. It becomes proof that closeness doesn't always have to come with fear, that it's possible to feel safe and connected at the same time. And once they've experienced that, they don't just forget it, they carry it with them, quietly, deeply. And in their own way, they start wanting more of it. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly in the only way they know how. And when they start wanting more of it, that's when something even deeper begins to unfold. Not on the surface, not in ways that are easy to point out, but internally, where most of their experience actually lives. Because wanting something they've spent so long avoiding creates a kind of quiet tension inside them. A tension between the part of them that has learned to stay independent at all costs and the part that is beginning to realize that independence doesn't have to mean isolation. And this is where their behavior becomes even more subtle, even more difficult to read. They don't suddenly move closer in obvious ways. They don't suddenly become expressive or emotionally open. Instead, they begin to linger. They take a little longer to respond than someone who is fully open, but less time than they used to. They stay present in conversations just a little bit longer before pulling away. They allow moments of silence without feeling the need to escape immediately. And those small shifts, they're not random. They're intentional in a way they don't even fully recognize yet. Because for them, moving closer isn't about making a clear decision. It's about allowing themselves to not pull away. And that difference matters more than it seems. But even as they begin to allow that closeness in small doses, there's still a part of them that resists going too far too fast. Because deep down, they're still trying to understand one thing. If they let themselves feel this more often, will it stay safe? That question doesn't come with an easy answer. So instead of rushing toward it, they test it. They observe how you react over time. They notice whether your energy stays consistent or changes. They pay attention to whether closeness with you continues to feel calm or starts to feel overwhelming. And this process, it's not something they talk about. It's something they experience quietly, because for them, trust isn't built through words. It's built through repeated emotional experiences that don't trigger their need to protect themselves. And every time they're around you and don't feel that pressure, every time they sense that same calm they felt in that hug, a small layer of resistance begins to fade. Not completely, but enough to make them stay a little more open than before. And as those layers slowly soften, something unexpected starts to happen. They begin to feel a kind of emotional attachment that doesn't feel threatening in the way they're used to. It's not intense or overwhelming. It doesn't feel like it's taking over their sense of self. Instead, it feels steady, quiet, almost grounding. And that kind of attachment is unfamiliar to them. Because they're used to two extremes, either distance that feels safe but empty, or closeness that feels intense but overwhelming. But this feels different. It feels like something in between, something balanced. And that balance is what allows them to stay. Not perfectly, not without moments of hesitation or distance, but more than they ever have before. And the more they stay in that space, the more they begin to realize that connection doesn't have to be something they survive. It can be something they experience, something they even begin to enjoy. But even then, even as they begin to experience connection in a way that feels less threatening, there's still something they struggle with, expressing it. Because feeling something and showing it are two very different things for them. They might feel deeply affected by your presence. They might think about you more than they expect. They might even start to care in ways that go beyond what they're comfortable admitting. But translating those feelings into words or actions, that's where they hesitate. Not because the feelings aren't real, but because expressing them feels like crossing a line they're not fully ready to cross. So instead, they show it in the only way they know how. By not leaving, by coming back, by staying connected in small, consistent ways that don't require them to fully expose what they feel inside. And if you're not paying attention, it's easy to miss. It's easy to assume that because they're not saying much, they're not feeling much. But in reality, their silence often carries more meaning than words ever could. And when you step back and look at the full picture, everything starts to make sense in a way it didn't before. That hug wasn't just a moment, it was an opening. A quiet, unexpected opening into a part of them they've kept hidden for a long time. A part that craves closeness, but only when it feels safe. A part that wants connection, but not at the cost of losing themselves. A part that doesn't need intensity or pressure, just presence, just calm, just the kind of closeness that allows them to exist without fear. And when they find that, even briefly, it changes them. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in quiet, lasting ones. It changes how they see connection. It changes how they respond to you. It changes what they begin to allow themselves to feel. And most importantly, it changes what they start to want. Because once they've experienced that kind of safe closeness, they don't just forget it. They don't just move on like it didn't matter. They carry it with them in the way they hesitate before pulling away, in the way they stay just a little longer, in the way they slowly, carefully begin to open in ways they never thought they would. And that's why they melt. Not because they're weak, Not because they suddenly change overnight, but because for a brief moment, they stop protecting themselves from something they've always needed. And in that moment, they finally feel it. The connection they've been avoiding is the same connection they've been craving all along.